Hello, and welcome to the Diegetic Advancement Podcast. I'm Riley, and today we're going to talk about adventure design for game completeness. In the last post, I mentioned some frustration with prepping Shadowdark, and so I wanted to dive into that a little bit more. Is adventure design guidance required to make a game complete? And what does good guidance even look like? But first, a comment on feedback. This blog is very new, but the podcast has been around for a little while now. And I'm very thankful for the people that interact with me over there. With this new format comes the question of how to handle that interaction. So this is what I think I'll do. I will have standalone episodes responding to feedback purely posted on the podcast, and I'll call out themes or quotes from feedback where it's relevant to further blog posts. Just like this feedback from Daniel from Bandits Keep. You can find Daniel's RPG stuff on YouTube at Bandits Keep, and as a co-host of the excellent podcast Monsters and Treasure. Links to that will be in the show notes. First, thanks for the call, Daniel, and for the feedback. I'm going to paraphrase Daniel's thoughts on the subject here. Forgive me if I've misinterpreted anything or taken anything out of context. Daniel broadly agrees with my premise, though he places extra emphasis on the importance of having guidance for what an adventure should look and feel like, rather than just simply having tables, charts, or procedures to create one. He calls out good examples like Into the Odd, which gives a good idea of what the characters will be doing, and BX for great guidance on creating adventures. Also, that an example adventure is also a great thing to have included. Other than to say I agree, I won't dwell on these thoughts now, as I'll cover them in the rest of the article. But thanks again, Daniel, for calling in. I'm shamelessly using this call as the inspiration for this post. Examples. So let's look at some examples of a few game systems and what content they have for adventure generation and guidance for running the game. Firstly, Shadowdark. So listening back, I think I might have been a little bit harsh on Shadowdark. I still broadly stand by my comments, but I want to highlight that I'm exceptionally time poor or lazy, and so I have a preference for certain types of prep assistance. I want to go back through the book and highlight some of the things that Shadowdark has to help you prep games, and maybe share some deeper thoughts on what's included. A quick note on what I think Shadowdark does really well. It explains the gameplay procedures. A good portion of the book is dedicated not just to the rules of the characters, magic, and making checks, the basics, but also how to adjudicate crawling through a dungeon, what that should feel like, how to handle torches and light, and their importance. Of course, it also includes the ever-helpful example of play. A lot of newer games get the fair criticism that they assume you know how to play, either that you've played before or read from some other source, but I think you could very easily pick up Shadowdark as your first game and get it, or come from 5e, some other game, and understand the difference in style. Okay, so I've tried to write this section a couple of times and it's working out too long, so let me just dot point out some good and not so good points in my opinion. Firstly, the good. It has good guidance on systems of running the game, like light, random encounters, general principles for running the game, and the important example of play. It has lots of random tables, all of which seem very usable as inspiration in prep or to improv from in a session. There are random generations for dungeons, wilderness, and settlements that have you dropping dice and sketching around them. These are good for inspiration as well. And I could break all that down into many good points, but I'll keep it grouped up for the sake of brevity. And not included in the rulebook, but I believe it comes with the system or is free. There is a good adventure which you could draw a lot of advice from. Good example adventure, sorry. The not so good. Confusing guidance on treasure. Because the relationship between gold and XP is abstract, I'm not sure how much XP I should be aiming for, and an average amount of gold is provided by adventuring party level, but not what that means in XP terms. Lack of guidance on when and how to use the tables. All the tables are fantastic, but they're lacking support for how and when to use them. For example, the dungeon generation will give you a theme and a general idea of the contents of the room, but guidance for actually stocking it is lacking. What monsters and how many and what treasure XP should they have? Monster guidance. We get an idea of the level range we might see in monsters hidden in the generation tables, and the advice that a 1-to-1 split of character level and monster level should produce an average encounter, but this only gives me details for a specific encounter, not for creating an adventure or dungeon. Treasure guidance. The only advice is that wandering monsters have treasure 50% of the time, which I then assume other encounters have treasure 100% of the time, and that treasure can be generated randomly using the tables provided. I find the random tables to be too specific and again suffers from the abstract relation between XP and gold. So a couple of things to note. I titled the bad section not so good because I think most of it is pretty close to being good, and my good points mirror the not so good points. There is guidance for creating a dungeon, but it's lacking some guidance for stocking it. There's lots to like and lots that is usable, but I do feel like I'm left wanting a bit more. Here's what I think would be helpful and make it go from good to great. An example of creating a dungeon adventure would be amazing. A list of monsters by level or dungeon level would be even better, and some guidance on numbers, both for single encounters and larger groups. As a side note, I don't find the 1-to-1 ratio for placing monsters terribly satisfying. Are all monsters equally challenging at the same hit dice? Do they not vary in number based on their rarity or the culture of that particular monster? It would also benefit from some more advice on placing treasure and its relationship to XP. Working this out is quite difficult and further complicated by carousing, which gives you random amounts of XP for gold spent. So some advice to get the pacing of advancement right would be great, and some structure around when and how to use the random tables. That is all that I think it would take. In my personal experience, the thing I struggled with was how much treasure to award. I didn't find the random tables terribly satisfying, except in a pinch when players might find something I had prepped that I hadn't prepped for, and how many and what monsters to place. For example, I know there's a goblin tribe raiding a popular road into a village, and figure they must be holed up in a cave nearby. How many goblins would there be? Do they have a structure? Are there leader goblins? And how much treasure XP will they have? For that, I can turn to BX, which tells me the amount found, 6d10, that there is a 3 hit dice leader and who has 2d6 bodyguards, and that they have an average on 1,000 gold pieces in their stash, and small groups will likely have a few coins on them. So let's quickly look at some other games whilst we're here. As I just mentioned, BX, specifically the basic set. I believe that came with B2, which is an excellent reference for the expected style of game. It also has a great example of play, and importantly for this topic, some amazing guidance for designing adventures. If you're making a game and think this stuff is important, use this as a reference. Here's the gist of it. 1. Choose a scenario. There's a list of 10 different scenarios provided with descriptions and examples. 2. Choose a setting. Are you in a crypt or a castle? 3. Decide on special monsters, not randomly placed. Draw the dungeon, then stock the dungeon, and it provides a random stocking table with examples of how to fill the results, and then fill in the details, add flavor to the rooms and things like that. This is all accompanied by tables for the appropriate monsters, their numbers and structure, what treasure they have, what treasure they're likely to have, to help fill things out. It is missing something which Shadowdark has, which is assistance on drawing the map. This would be a great addition. Personally, it's something I struggle with and get stuck on. Then there is an example of that exact procedure being used to generate a dungeon, which you could then use as another starter adventure in addition to B2. If this style interests you, I can recommend a series by Daniel Norton on adventure design, where he goes through and creates an adventure for each of these 10 scenarios, plus plenty more videos on the topic. That'll be linked in the show notes as well. Next up is Into the Odd. Daniel also mentioned this game, which has to be my favorite rules light system, maybe alongside Black Sword Hack or some of the Borg games. Maybe Pirate Borg is my favorite there. So what has Into the Odd got going for it? Well, it's got a lot of the good stuff from the other two. It's got an example of play, tables for inspiration, and great principles advice for playing, and of course a very good starter adventure as an example. It also exudes character, which it needs to do, as it's different from a typical D&D premise, but doesn't stray too far. And so it needs to communicate how it's different and what it should play like. But it is missing the procedure of BX. The list of monsters, hazards, and treasure are lacking. There's not really guidance for placing them. A great book, well worth the read, but I think you need to rely on your own trial and error or creativity or other systems. How about we look at something fairly new and in a different genre? Mothership. The Warden's Manual for Mothership is another book alongside Into the Odd that has some great advice for how to run a game, but does it have advice for how to put a session together? Yes, it does. It even starts on page 4, the first actual page of content. Now, of course, it's cheating in that you've probably had to read the player's manual, whereas other books we've looked at have been a single volume. It does show an understanding of the importance of actually explaining how to run a game. I think this is the best that I've read as well. We get a series of 10 scenarios and settings similar to BX, guidance of creating horror, which is helpful given the difference in genre to what's typical, maybe. It has examples on creating different types of obstacles, such as creating interesting encounters, puzzles, and NPCs. It has instructions for creating a map, yay, for both for drawing it and keying it. And as a bonus, it gives you steps for actually running a first session. This is really excellent stuff. Now for a quick couple of notable mentions. I think the very first role-playing games got this right. Even OD&D, as confusing as it is, has systems for creating the content you actually need to play. It is worth shouting out, though I don't think I'm educating any listeners with these suggestions, the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide for Fantasy and Traveller for Sci-Fi. These are filled with systems to create content that you can actually use to play. I imagine there are a bunch of other games and systems from this early era that are similarly useful. Okay, in conclusion, the first conclusion I want to make is that completeness is probably not even all that important a metric for deciding if a game is good or fun or worth your time. So, discard any value judgments on games that I might have accidentally made here. Depending on what the reader wants out of the book, it's going to be subjective anyway. However, we see good examples of it at the start of the hobby and in new products coming out today. And the great news is that they don't take up all that much space, so why not include it? In my opinion, things like, well, you can just make it up yourself or you can get it elsewhere is not a good excuse. Including something does not prohibit me from making it up on my own, ignoring the advice given and doing something completely different, or using a different system altogether. So what do I like in adventure design guidance? Here's a sort of checklist. 1. Examples. 2. Guidance. 3. Procedures. And 4. Tools. This is a very generic list, but I think it covers what you need. A lot of the games only have 2 or 3 of these. Okay, that's all I have to say for the moment. So what do you think? Have I got it all wrong? Have I missed something? Am I just really lazy? Send me an email or call me on, send me a voice message on SpeakPipe. I'm also in Discord. You feel free to send me a message there if you can find me. Details for all of that will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and bye for now.